Documentary of the entire history of the British Empire in few minutes. Let discover what the past was hidden. The shots did not come with a warning. There was no announcement, no chance to leave, no mercy. In a walled garden in northern India, thousands of unarmed civilians gathered under the afternoon sun. Men stood shoulder to shoulder. Women held children by the hand. Some had come to protest. Some had come to listen. Some had come simply because it was a day off. They did not know they had walked into a trap. British soldiers entered the garden and positioned themselves at the exits. Rifles were raised. Orders were given. And then the firing began. Bullets tore through the crowd. People ran toward walls that offered no escape. They fell over one another, screaming, bleeding, praying. The firing did not stop when people dropped. It continued until the soldiers ran low on ammunition. When it was over, the ground was soaked dark. This was not an accident. This was not panic. This was policy. And for the British Empire, it was not an ending. It was a revelation. Because the true question of history is not just what happened in that garden, but how an island thousands of miles away became powerful enough to decide who lived and who died there at all. To answer that, we must go back, far back. Long before it ruled continents, Britain was nothing special, just an island on the edge of Europe. Cold, wet, poor. Its early inhabitants lived in scattered tribes, fighting over land that could barely feed them. Power came and went quickly. The Romans arrived and imposed order. They built roads, walls, and cities. Then they left. And when they did, Britain collapsed into chaos. Kings rose and fell in blood. Vikings burned coastal villages. Norman invaders crossed the sea and took the crown by force. For centuries, England was not feared. It was invaded. It was divided. It was weak. While empires rose elsewhere, in China, the Islamic world, and South Asia, England struggled simply to survive. But history does not always favor the strongest. Sometimes, it favors the most ruthless. By the late 1400s, something new was happening. Europe was waking up to the idea of global wealth, and England was watching closely. Across the seas, Spain and Portugal were getting rich. Ships returned from distant lands loaded with gold, silver, spices, and stories of unimaginable wealth. Kings grew richer overnight. Cities transformed. England watched from the sidelines. It lacked the ships. It lacked the money. It lacked the confidence. But it learned. It learned how trade routes worked. It learned how conquest paid. And most importantly, it learned that violence, when done far away, could be hidden. In 1497, an English ship sailed west under the command of John Cabot. He reached North America. There was no gold, no empire to conquer. So England forgot about it for nearly a century. But the idea remained. And then, everything changed. In 1588, Spain decided England had grown too dangerous. The Spanish Armada, the greatest naval force the world had ever seen, sailed to end England forever. England was outnumbered, outgunned, outmatched. Defeat seemed inevitable. But nature intervened. Storms shattered Spanish ships. English fire ships caused chaos. Panic spread. Spain retreated. England survived. And from that survival came a belief that would poison history for centuries. That God favored England. That survival meant destiny. That ruling others was not just allowed. It was ordained. From that moment on, England stopped asking how to survive and started asking how to dominate. England turned its eyes to the ocean. Ships were built faster and stronger. Sailors were trained for war, not just travel. And piracy became policy. Men like Francis Drake attacked Spanish treasure fleets across the Atlantic. Officially, he was a criminal. Unofficially, he was a national hero. Gold flooded into England. Confidence followed. The ocean became a battlefield. Trade became theft. And theft became empire. England learned a simple truth. You don't need to conquer land if you can control the sea. In 1607, English settlers landed at Jamestown. They were unprepared, hungry, terrified. Local native tribes helped them survive. They shared food. They shared knowledge. They shared land. The English repaid that kindness with conquest. More settlers arrived. More land was taken. Treaties were signed and broken. Forests fell. Villages burned. Populations collapsed. This became the imperial pattern. Help first. Control next. Violence last. By the 1700s, Britain controlled 13 American colonies. But control alone was not enough. Empire demanded labor, and labor would be stolen. Ships left British ports loaded with goods. They sailed to Africa, and they returned with human cargo. Men, women, and children were chained together below deck. Disease spread. Death was constant. Those who survived were sold in the Americas. Sugar, cotton, tobacco. British cities grew rich. Banks expanded. London glittered. And the suffering that paid for it was hidden across oceans. The empire told itself stories. That this was trade. That this was business. That this was civilization. But the truth was simpler. Empire was built on pain. No land fed the British Empire more than India. At first, Britain came as a guest. The East India Company promised trade, not rule. But trade became control. Company armies grew. Local rulers were manipulated, defeated, or erased. By the late 1700s, a corporation ruled millions. Taxes crushed farmers. Food was exported while people starved. Famines followed. Millions died. And the empire called it order. India was not conquered overnight. It was drained slowly. As Britain expanded, its hunger grew. Africa was divided by straight lines drawn on European maps. Australia was declared empty, despite its ancient civilizations. Languages were erased. Cultures broken. Resistance crushed. Yet the empire showed the world its polished face. Railways, schools, courts. It said, "Look what we built." It never said what it destroyed. And so we returned to that garden. Jallianwala Bagh. This time, the world could not look away. The massacre was reported, photographed, discussed. Some in Britain defended it. Others were horrified. But the illusion was broken. Empire was no longer a distant rumor. It was visible, and it was brutal. 2 world wars drained Britain dry. Money vanished. Power faded. Colonies demanded freedom. India rose first. Africa followed. Flags were lowered. Borders were rushed. Violence exploded. The empire did not fade. It collapsed. By the mid-1900s, the British Empire was officially over. But its shadow remained. Its language, its systems, its influence. And in the final days, something else happened. Documents disappeared. Files were burned. Archives sealed. Historians began to ask, what did Britain destroy before it left? What truths were never meant to be read? Because some believed the most shocking secrets of the empire were not its crimes, but how carefully they were erased. And next, we uncover the papers Britain tried to make disappear forever. The story is far from over. The fires burned quietly. There were no crowds, no announcements, no headlines. In colonial offices across Africa, Asia, and the Middle East, doors were locked late at night. Lights stayed on after staff had gone home. Men stood over furnaces and metal bins, feeding them paper. Folders disappeared one by one. Ink curled and blackened. Signatures vanished into smoke. There were no witnesses. Only the smell of burning paper drifting into empty corridors. The British Empire was ending, and someone was afraid of what would be found when it was gone. This was not chaos. It was careful. Every document destroyed meant a story that could never be told. Every name burned meant a life reduced to silence. And this was happening everywhere. At the very moment the empire claimed to be leaving with dignity. As independence approached, colonial governors received instructions from London. Not public instructions. Not parliamentary debates. Private orders. Sensitive files were not to remain behind. Not records of schools or railways. Not tax laws or infrastructure plans. Those were safe. The danger lay elsewhere. Reports of beatings carried out in police stations. Lists of prisoners who never returned. Orders approving collective punishment. Letters describing deaths that could not be explained. These papers were classified. Some were destroyed on the spot. Some were packed into crates and shipped to Britain. Others were hidden in basements, vaults, and forgotten storage facilities. The process had a name. It was called Operation Legacy, and it was designed to erase memory itself. After World War II, Britain was exhausted. Its cities lay in ruins. Its economy was shattered. Its people were rationing food. The illusion of endless power was gone. But the empire remained. India, Kenya, Malaya, Cyprus. Hundreds of millions of people lived under British rule. They were told independence would come, but not yet, because Britain still needed time. Time to stabilize. Time to control the narrative. Time to make sure the truth never arrived with freedom. India had changed. The massacre at Jallianwala Bagh had cracked something open. Faith in British justice collapsed. Protests spread across cities and villages. Strikes halted railways. Students filled prisons. One man stood at the center of it all. Mahatma Gandhi. He carried no weapon. He called for nonviolence. He asked people to simply refuse. Britain responded the only way it knew how. Arrests, censorship, force. Gandhi went to prison. So did tens of thousands of others. But this time, fear did not work. India would not be held. By 1947, Britain accepted the inevitable. India would be free. But the exit was hurried. Borders were drawn by men unfamiliar with the land, the languages, the religions. Lines were sketched on maps in distant offices. India was split in two. India, Pakistan. What followed was chaos. Communities fractured overnight. Families fled in opposite directions. Trains arrived packed with corpses. Up to 1 million people died. Britain called it a tragic misunderstanding. But Britain had drawn the line. And then it left. In Africa, the empire promised reform. But people demanded freedom. In Kenya, anger had been building for decades. Land seized by settlers. Forced labor. Public beatings. A movement rose among the Kikuyu people. The Mau Mau. Britain called them terrorists. What followed was a war fought in silence. Villages were cleared. Entire populations were herded into detention camps. Men were interrogated until bones broke. Women were abused. Children watched. Torture was routine, and everything was documented. By the mid-1950s, over 1 million Kenyans were confined. Behind barbed wire. Under armed guard. These were not called prisons. They were called villages. Inside, hunger ruled. Disease spread freely. Guards decided who was punished and who disappeared. British officials filed reports. They described what was happening in precise language. They asked for guidance. They received approval. London knew, but the public did not. Newspapers stayed quiet. Parliament avoided questions. And when independence approached, the order was clear. Destroy the files. In Southeast Asia, Britain faced another rebellion. In Malaya, communist fighters moved through jungles. Britain declared an emergency. Villages were burned. Food supplies destroyed. Entire communities relocated behind fences. It was brutal, and it worked. Britain won. The methods used there became a model for counterinsurgency across the empire. A guidebook written in blood. And like all dangerous books, it was meant to disappear. In Cyprus, young men demanded independence. Bombs exploded. Attacks followed. Britain responded with executions. Teenagers were hanged inside prison walls. Families were not told in advance. Bodies were buried secretly. Graves were hidden. There were no public funerals. No protests. No memories allowed. The records were sealed. And then removed. Back in Britain, the empire still looked respectable. Schoolbooks spoke of order and progress. Films showed calm officers and grateful subjects. The violence was absent. Because the evidence was gone. Or so it seemed. History had been edited. And the edits were deliberate. Decades passed. Then, in the early 2000s, survivors in Kenya spoke. Elderly men and women described the camps. The torture. The deaths. They sued the British government. Britain denied everything. There were no records, officials said. No proof. Then a lawyer asked one question. Where are the files? The silence that followed said everything. In 2011, deep inside a government storage facility, boxes were found. Unmarked. Dust-covered. Locked for half a century. Inside were documents from 37 former colonies. Reports of torture. Orders for punishment. Letters begging for intervention. The truth had survived. The collection had a name. The Migrated Archives. The files confirmed what Britain had denied. Abuse was approved from above. Deaths were hidden. Justice was deliberately obstructed. Judges were stunned. The government apologized. Compensation was paid. But no one went to prison. And many files were still missing. Burned. Gone forever. The man in '01 remembers he left no statue. No street carried his name. No school taught his story. No monument marked his passing. When the British Empire fell, he vanished with it. And yet, his signature shaped the final years of imperial rule. Not through speeches. Not through commands shouted on battlefields. But through ink. Quiet lines written at the bottom of documents that decided what the world would remember. And what it would never know. At first, the name meant nothing. It appeared in margins. On routing slips. On memos stamped confidential. Sometimes typed. Sometimes handwritten. Sometimes half-burned at the edge of a page. Historians ignored it. Just another civil servant. Just another administrator in a vast bureaucracy. But the name kept returning. Kenya, Malaya, Cyprus, Palestine. Dozens of collapsing colonies. Always near the same phrases. Destroy after review. Remove before transfer. not for local release. Patterns do not lie, and this pattern was everywhere. He did not command troops. He did not interrogate prisoners. He never stood at the gates of a camp, but he controlled paper. And paper was power. Paper decided what governments could deny. Paper decided what courts could prove. Paper decided whether victims would be believed. Empires are remembered through records. He decided which records survived. He was born into comfort, educated in England's finest institutions, trained in law, procedure, and discipline. He believed in systems, in hierarchy, in order. By the 1930s, he worked inside the Colonial office, the nerve center of empire. Maps on walls, files stacked floor to ceiling, decisions that affected millions made quietly, behind closed doors. His job was stability. Protect British interests. Avoid scandal. Maintain control. Even as the world outside began to change. World War II reshaped him. He watched cities burn under bombing raids. He saw how propaganda could move nations, how secrets could decide victory or defeat. Information was not neutral. Information was a weapon. After the war, Britain was weakened. Its empire could no longer rule openly through force alone. If it was going to fall, it had to fall without noise. The rebellions after 1945 were different. They were not fought on open fields. They were fought in villages, in jungles, in detention camps. Britain responded with methods it had never wanted documented. Forced labor, collective punishment, interrogation techniques that crossed every legal line. Public statements remained calm. Law and order restored. Private reports told the truth, and every one of them crossed his desk. At first, he restricted access. Files marked confidential, then secret, then something more final. As independence dates approached, panic spread through colonial administrations. New governments would ask questions. They would demand records. They would search for names. So he proposed a solution. Not loud, not dramatic, administrative. A plan to protect Britain. By controlling the past. The instructions were precise. Anything that could embarrass Britain, expose illegal actions, damage future relations, must not remain. Governors were ordered to review every file. Some documents were shipped back to Britain under cover of night. Others were destroyed locally. Fires burned across Africa. Shredders screamed in Asia. Crates left ports without records. The empire was erasing itself. Systematically. Not everyone agreed. Some officials objected. They said records belonged to the people. That history mattered. That destruction was dangerous. He dismissed them. This is about stability, he argued. This is about the future. But stability for whom? And whose future was being protected? Kenya tested the limits of silence. The Mau Mau uprising produced reports so disturbing that even experienced officers hesitated. Descriptions of torture, executions without trial, camps designed to break men. The files arrived in London. They were read, and then they were removed. Justice was erased line by line. He never held a weapon. He never raised his voice in anger. He worked in offices with polished desks and clean windows. But he knew. Every report described pain in detail, and every decision to remove it was deliberate. Silence was not ignorance. Silence was choice. As independence accelerated, his influence grew. Governors relied on him. Ministers trusted him. He became the final filter. What passed through him became history. What did not, disappeared. He carried the weight of empire's conscience, and he buried it. By the early 1960s, collapse was unstoppable. Africa broke free. The Caribbean followed. Asia was already gone. Warehouses in Britain filled with crates. Unmarked, unlisted, sealed. Only a handful of people knew where they were. He was one of them. Then, quietly, he retired. No inquiry. No investigation. No headlines. He moved to the countryside, lived comfortably, spoke rarely, and never publicly explained his role. History moved on without him. Years passed. Former colonies struggled with borders drawn in haste, with systems built for control, not freedom. Britain spoke proudly of its imperial past. The crimes remained buried, or so it seemed. In the 1980s, historians noticed gaps, missing years, missing correspondence, entire events with no official trace. Requests were denied. Files were lost, or said to never exist. But absence tells its own story. One researcher asked a simple question. Who decided what to destroy? The answers were vague, until a memo surfaced. Half-burned, undated, but signed. The signature matched others. Same curves, same pressure, same hand. The man behind Operation Legacy had left a fingerprint, and it pointed toward a door that had been locked for decades. After his death, his house was cleared. Family members found boxes, personal letters, draft memos, notes never meant for public eyes. They contacted authorities. Officials arrived quickly. Too quickly. The boxes were taken. No copies allowed. One note was glimpsed briefly. Just a sentence. History will judge us only by what remains. It was not a defense. It was a strategy. If history only judges what remains, then what was removed? Which stories were erased before they could speak? Which nations were shaped by silence instead of truth? Across continents, the same files were missing. Interrogation methods, camp conditions, orders from London. This was not coincidence. It was architecture. Historians now agree. He was not alone, but he was central, a symbol of how empires fall, not with confession, but with control. In former colonies, memory did not depend on paper. Scars remained. Trauma remained. The truth lived in bodies. But the world demands evidence. And evidence had been stolen. Borders drawn in haste still cause war. Legal systems designed for control still govern lives. Economic dependence continues. The empire ended. Its consequences did not. Was the destruction legal? Was it moral? Was it treason against history itself? Among historians, a rumor persists. One final file. Not destroyed. Not migrated. Hidden somewhere no one thought to look. A file that names names. A file that proves orders came from the very top. And in the final chapter, we follow that trail and ask the hardest question of all. If the truth is finally revealed, is the world ready to face it? It was not hidden in a vault. It was not sealed behind steel doors. It was not buried underground. The final secret of the British Empire survived for one simple reason. No one thought it mattered. In the rush to destroy, to hide, to erase, this one piece was overlooked. Not because it was harmless, but because it looked ordinary. And sometimes, the most dangerous truths hide in plain sight. For decades, historians searched. They walked the corridors of government buildings. They filed requests. They opened boxes that smelled of dust and age. Each time, they were told the same thing. There is nothing else. No further records. No missing links. No unanswered questions. But history does not disappear cleanly. It leaks. Through mistakes. Through neglect. Through human assumption. Far from London, in a record center rarely visited, there was a small room. No guards. No alarms. No sense of importance. A junior archivist noticed something odd. A box pushed to the side. Mislabeled. Ignored for years. It was not marked confidential. Not marked restricted. It was marked routine correspondence. That single word saved it. Inside were letters. Notes written in careful handwriting. Drafts never meant to be final. Documents too boring to destroy. They were not dramatic. No screaming headlines. No graphic descriptions. And yet, at the center of the box, there was one document. A quiet one. A connective one. The kind of document empires fear most. This paper did not describe violence directly. It did something far more dangerous. It connected responsibility. It showed how reports moved upward, how concerns were summarized, how uncomfortable truths were softened. Step by step, from camps, to colonial governors, to officials in London, and then, to the very top. For decades, Britain's defense had been simple. Local officers acted alone. Excesses were isolated. London did not know. The document destroyed that argument. It showed awareness. It showed discussion. It showed decisions made with full knowledge of consequences. This was not disorder. This was not accident. This was policy. If this truth had surfaced earlier, the consequences would have been enormous. Court cases across continents. Demands for reparations. Global humiliation. The image of Britain as a fair and lawful empire would have collapsed. So another choice was made. Not confession, but forgetting. For former colonies, forgetting was never possible. Stories were passed down quietly. Scars became living records. Memory replaced paper. But without documents, those voices were dismissed. Unreliable. Emotional. Unproven. History favored ink. Until the ink returned. As fragments of the truth emerged, responses followed. Apologies were issued. Carefully worded. Legally precise. Emotionally distant. Compensation was paid. But justice stopped there. No trials. No prison sentences. No names held accountable. The empire said, "We are sorry." It did not say, "We chose this." The British Empire no longer ruled territory. But its system survived. Banks shaped economies. Trade laws favored old powers. Borders drawn in haste became permanent scars. Control no longer required soldiers. It required contracts. The empire changed form, not function. A new generation began to ask what had been ignored. Why do some nations struggle while others prosper? Why do borders feel unnatural? Why does wealth still flow in one direction? The answers did not lie in the present. They lay in decisions made quietly, decades earlier. Decisions written down and almost destroyed. The empire ended on paper. But history does not end when flags are lowered. It ends when truth is faced. And that moment has not fully arrived. Not yet. The British Empire left railways, courts, schools. It also left graves. Both are real. Both are history. To accept one and ignore the other is not balance. It is denial. Imagine the empire at its height. Red covering the map. Ships crossing every ocean. The sun never setting. Now imagine the same map without color. Just borders. Just names. Just people living with inherited consequences. That is the empire's true outline. History does not demand perfection. It demands honesty. Because when truth is hidden, it does not vanish. It waits. In memory. In scars. In forgotten boxes. The greatest empire on earth believed it could control the past. It was wrong. Because the past always returns. And when it does, it asks only one question. Will you look away? Or will you finally see? The end of the British Empire was not the end of its story. It was the moment the world had to decide what that story truly meant.